Hi, thank you for joining dinCloud's webinar, Strengthening Security in the Cloud. Before we jump into today's content, I'll introduce our speakers. We have Michael Osterman joining us, Principal Analyst from Osterman Research, as well as dinCloud's very own CMO, Ollie Din. So without further ado, Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank dinCloud for the opportunity to present Strengthening Security in the Cloud. Just a little bit about Osterman Research so you understand our perspective in all of this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, and we're very focused on the messaging, web, and collaboration industries. Essentially, we look at all of the technologies, processes, and practices around how people communicate and collaborate in the workplace. So we look at things like security, obviously, archiving, encryption, authentication, content management. We're very heavily focused on the cloud. We also look at on-premises solutions and so forth. And we have a very strong emphasis on primary research that we conduct with decision makers and influencers. We're continually doing primary research studies really so that we can understand the problems that organizations are experiencing, how they'd like to solve those problems, what they plan to do in the future, and so forth. The company's coming up on 17 years old, and we're based near Seattle. So the fundamental issue that almost every organization faces, and really at a very high level within the organization, is data loss. Data breaches are a very common occurrence. We hear about them in the popular press and the trade press. It's hard to open, an internet news site or a newspaper without seeing, some news about data loss in some form or another. And there are a couple of major causes of data loss. And, certainly there are lots, but we're going to focus today on ransomware and the physical loss of devices. Ransomware is really a multi-billion-dollar problem. The FBI has identified that ransomware cost organizations, about $1 billion last year, and that number is going to be substantially greater this year. Ransomware is in the news on a regular basis, and we're seeing large organizations, mid-sized ones, and small ones, including things like, police departments and hospitals and all sorts of organizations get hit very hard with ransomware. In the UK, for example, the National Health Service, the NHS, has been extraordinarily victimized by ransomware, and there have been numerous problems. And we're getting to the point where ransomware is now not just a financial issue where organizations are losing billions of dollars, but now it's a life and death issue. There's a city that was hit by ransomware, I believe in Tennessee, that is still recovering, and their attack was a few weeks ago. And it's impacting their ability to dispatch 911 calls, and really it's having a wide variety of impacts on city services. So, it's really a fundamental issue that every organization has to deal with, regardless of the industry they're in, regardless of the size of the organization. Now, one of the fundamental problems with ransomware is not just the ransomware itself, but it's the fact that many organizations don't adequately back up their data. And those poor backup practices result in many cases files being lost permanently. We have seen situations where companies have been completely wiped out from a data perspective because they didn't have good backups. And even those that do have good backups will still have gaps in the data. Maybe the backup occurred last night or a couple of nights ago. So there's going to be missing data, even in a best case scenario, using conventional security technologies, conventional backup practices, and so forth. And data stored on physical devices is really a major contributor to loss from ransomware. We have done a number of surveys around ransomware, and we found that many times a single endpoint will get infected, but in many cases, an entire network can get infected. So it hits one endpoint and then spreads to every device on the network, and that's particularly true for small organizations. And so it not only has the impact of financial loss and potential life and death types of issues, but also it can actually shut a business down for a time until that business has been able to recover, either from backups or just simply recreating its own data. There's also the issue of physical loss of devices. And, we've all heard scenarios where a coworker or a friend or a family member has lost a smartphone, they've lost a tablet, maybe going through a TSA security checkpoint, maybe leaving it in a restaurant or in a movie theater, what have you. PrivacyRights.org is really a very good database of data breaches. They've been tracking these kinds of breaches since 2005. And they have tracked 7,731 data breaches totaling over 1 billion records that have been made public in the last 12 years. And what's interesting is that about 15% of those breaches and 17% of the records involved really involve physical loss of portable devices. So, people having proprietary information, customer records, what have you, on a mobile device, a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, and then either losing that device, again, at a TSA checkpoint, maybe having it stolen out of a car, what have you. So the physical loss of devices represents an enormous vector for the loss of data in organizations, and it can have really far-reaching impacts. 48 U.S. states, for example, have data breach notification requirements. And so if you lose somebody's data, if you lose customer information and that data was not encrypted, you as the organization that lost the data are obligated to inform individuals in those states that you lost the data. And when we're talking about things like the General Data Protection Regulation, the new Data Protection Directive that's going to be implemented in the European Union beginning in May 25th, 2018, we're looking at very strict notification requirements and enormous consequences if an organization somehow loses data and that data was not encrypted. So, certainly ransomware is a critical issue, but so is the physical loss of devices. And the consequences of those losses can continue far beyond just the cost of the data itself or the cost of reconstructing it. So the bottom line is that organizations lose lots of devices. An AT&T sponsored study conducted by Ponemon, for example, this was a study of very large organizations, found that 37% of the mobile devices that were lost contained some kind of sensitive or confidential content, maybe customer records, maybe employee records. There's lots of sensitive information that employees will carry with them on a laptop or a smartphone or a tablet. And quite often that data is not encrypted. It should be as a best practice, but very often it isn't. So when a laptop is lost, you can potentially lose a few 100,000 customer records, which can have enormous consequences for an organization. Lost devices cost the organizations that were studied by Ponemon an average of a little over $3.4 million per year. So we're looking at major expenses related to the physical loss of devices. Also, malware-infected devices cost these organizations slightly more, about $3.7 million per year. So we're looking at not only just the physical loss of devices, but also malware infections that can corrupt data, that can cause it to be lost, that cause downtime in the organization and so forth, also impose a major cost. And the data loss and malware infection combined represent a tax, if you want to call it that, of $308 per device per year on mobile devices. So we're looking not only at just the cost of the mobile device itself and the service that supports it and so forth, but now we're looking at data loss and malware infestation as another major cost of mobile device management that a lot of organizations don't consider. They don't add this kind of cost in when they're considering the cost of their mobile infrastructure, but they absolutely need to because it does represent an enormous cost for an organization. Now, in terms of decision makers' biggest concerns, certainly two of the biggest concerns we have found in our own research are ransomware and physical theft or physical loss of devices. For example, we found that for ransomware, 56% of organizations really express a very high level of concern about ransomware impacting their organizations, and another 40% give it moderate concern. Only 4% of those we surveyed said that ransomware was not a concern. And what's particularly interesting here is that 96% of those we surveyed said that ransomware is a major concern for them, yet most organizations haven't been hit with ransomware in the last year. So they see this as this looming threat that could impact them at any time, even though most of them haven't yet gone through the pain and the misery associated with a full-blown ransomware attack. Also, with regard to physical theft of devices, there's a little bit less concern there, but it's still a major issue. Over 1/4 of the organizations we surveyed are really highly concerned about the physical theft of devices in their organization. Over half of the rest are moderately concerned. So we're looking at two major areas of concern for IT departments, for line of business managers, for security departments, and so forth, not only because of just the direct cost of having to restore endpoints after a ransomware attack or having to replace lost devices, but all of the follow-on effects that literally can last for years going on, particularly if you have to notify victims of the breach, if you have to provide credit reporting services or whatever the case may be. There are long-lasting effects that go well beyond just the initial point of loss or attack. So fundamentally, decision makers really are right to be concerned. These are major problems that just about every organization will face at one point or another or already has faced. Most organizations have already been infiltrated by malware. They've been victimized by ransomware, or they've been, hacked in some way or suffered a DDoS attack. It's very difficult to find organizations in our research that haven't been the victim of something, whether it's a successful phishing attempt or spear phishing or business email compromise, malware infestation, physical loss of devices, and so forth. The vast majority have been impacted. Also, it's important to understand that, while we personally may not have lost a laptop or a mobile device, this is a very frequent occurrence. For example, as you can see here, a Kensington study found that a laptop is stolen every 53 seconds, and over 4% of company-issued smartphones are lost or stolen each year. So we're looking, in an organization, more than 1 in 25 employees will lose their company-issued smartphone every year. So this is a major cost to the enterprise. Again, not just because of the physical loss of the device, but also all of the follow-on costs that come along with this, which can actually be more than just the physical loss itself. So it's important to understand that really the proportion of organizations that have been the victims of some sort of cyber criminal attack and lost devices is probably higher than reported. When we do our surveys, when other organizations do their surveys, very often some of these victims are not going to want to self-report on what happened. They're not going to be eager to say, yeah, we were hit by ransomware and we lost, 3 weeks worth of files, or we lost, X number of mobile devices in the last year. They're reluctant to share that kind of information. And, it's understandable that they would be, because this is embarrassing. It represents a lack of good security protocols. In many cases, the data that was lost was not encrypted, and so organizations are not following best practice. So any numbers you see, whether it's from us or other organizations talking about ransomware infection or loss of physical devices, probably is going to be a little bit higher than what's actually reported, simply because of that reluctance to share, all of the dirty secrets of the organization. Also, as I mentioned earlier, ransomware really has not impacted most organizations, yet the vast majority are very concerned about it. And so there's this perceived looming threat of ransomware, and decision makers are right to be concerned about it. If they don't have the appropriate security protocols in place, if they haven't implemented security in the right way, if they're not protecting their data adequately, they have reason to be concerned, because ransomware can hit an organization at any time, just with a single click of the mouse on a malicious link in a spear phishing email, for example, and potentially an entire organization can be infected with ransomware. So it really is a very serious issue that organizations need to consider very carefully. So with regard to cybercrime, we're all familiar with a lot of the details of cybercrime, but suffice it to say that cyber criminals are very well funded. They make a lot of money from their activities, whether it's simple things like the ransom they get from ransomware, or their ability to install, let's say, a keystroke logger on a device and drain a bank account, or if it's a business email compromise attack where they're successful in getting funds wired to them and so forth. Cyber criminals really are very well funded. And ransomware obviously is now an enormous threat, and we're seeing a lot of money being made by cyber criminals as a result of their efforts around ransomware. Also, the attacks are now increasingly sophisticated. Cyber criminal organizations are using social engineering techniques to basically trick people into revealing secrets about themselves, their passwords, their security questions, and that happens through social media, it happens through email, it really happens through a wide variety of venues. And cyber criminals really are becoming much better at covering their tracks. It's very difficult to track down a cyber criminal and prosecute them under the law. It does happen periodically, and certainly law enforcement agencies around the world are, doing their work to try to get these people, but it's very difficult to do. Criminal activity is really just harder to detect now. Again, because the cyber criminals are quite good at covering their tracks, it's just that much tougher to find them. One of the issues, too, is dwell time. And there are a number of stats out there about the average length of dwell time. And by dwell time, we're talking about the length of time that a cyber criminal can penetrate a network before they're detected or before they actually start doing anything malicious. Quite often, a cyber criminal will break into a network and then start looking at the processes that the organization has put in place. They'll look at the recipients of wire transfers that are, particularly those that are receiving funds on a regular basis. They'll look at invoicing systems. They'll look at calendars to see when senior officials are out of the company, maybe on vacation, maybe traveling. And they basically are doing their own due diligence to find out how best to attack the organization. So if a cyber criminal is able to find out when wire transfers are made, the amounts of those transfers, to whom they're made, and so forth, and if they find that the CEO is out of the office, they can slip in a business email compromise attack to the company's CFO, for example. And these kinds of attacks have resulted in major losses, literally to the tune of tens of millions of dollars in single attacks. And so we're looking at, cyber criminals that are very sophisticated and can have dwell time of, 120 to 140 days, giving them lots of time to really learn about the organization and study their targets well. It's also important to note that cyber criminals, particularly Russian language-speaking cyber criminals, tend to be very cooperative with one another. They will share information, they'll share techniques, and they're really all in this together. They're very collaborative, and they work together to improve their craft. And so we, as the potential victims or actual victims of them, really are up against quite a formidable adversary. So, in light of the sophistication of cyber criminals, the large proportion of organizations that have been attacked and so forth, do organizations think they're doing a good job at protecting themselves? In some cases, yes, but in most cases, no. On the research we've done, we found that only 49% of organizations believe that they're really doing a good job at eliminating ransomware, for example, before it has an opportunity to reach end users. So 51% basically say, no, we're not doing a good job. Only 34% of organizations believe that they're doing a good job at protecting data attackers or protecting the data that attackers are looking for, so that the information is not going to be usable if it's breached. For example, encrypting that data or putting it in a repository that's going to be impervious to attackers. So fundamentally, organizations are self-reporting that they're not doing a very good job at protecting their infrastructure, at protecting the data that they need to protect. So fundamentally, we need a new paradigm. Things are not getting better. We're seeing things getting worse in many cases. For example, we asked organizations in the context of phishing or spear phishing, ransomware, and CEO fraud or business email compromise if things are getting better, if they're getting worse, if they're staying the same. And as you can see here, for a lot of organizations, things are just not getting better at all, and in many cases, they're getting worse. For example, in the context of phishing or spear phishing, half of the organizations in a recent survey told us that things are either staying the same or they're actually getting worse. We found similar numbers for ransomware and even greater numbers for things like CEO fraud and business email compromise. So most organizations simply are not finding that despite all of the money they've spent on security infrastructure and training and all the rest, that things are getting any better. Things are actually getting worse in many cases. And that's a fundamental problem. And it reveals that something is wrong with the paradigm, that despite the literally hundreds of billions that have been spent on security, things really aren't getting any better for many organizations. And the problem is that results in a lack of confidence. When we're looking at things like malware infections, ransomware infiltration, phishing, spear phishing, business email compromise, and so forth, it results in fairly low confidence for a lot of security decision makers, a lot of IT managers. They're just not very confident that they can do much about these attacks. Yet they're charged with protecting their organization's data assets, with protecting their users, with keeping users from doing dumb things that will allow malware in and so forth. So, it's really if you want to call it, a crisis of confidence for many in the security industry. What we also find is that today most spending on security is on premises. About $3 out of $4 spent on security in 2015 or 2017 is spent on some sort of on-premises infrastructure, and the rest is spent on the cloud. By 2019, though, that's going to be about a 50-50 split. That we're seeing a lot more security spending moving to the cloud for things like cloud gateways, and just a wide variety of security infrastructure designed to protect. Because organizations are realizing that on-premises infrastructure is not as adequate to solve all of their needs as they require to protect their organizations, to protect their data, to protect their users. That doesn't mean that on-premises is going away, but it does mean that cloud is going to be a more important component of security in the future. So fundamentally, what organizations need are three basic things. One, they need a better way to maintain user productivity so that they can provide users with all of the files, all of the data, all of the assets they need to be able to do their work effectively. And today, most often that's provided through some combination, some hybrid combination of on-premises data sources like file shares and data stored in the cloud. Organizations also need to minimize the chance that files will be lost through physical loss of devices or ransomware infections that wipe out large data sets. They need to reduce the overall corporate risk by doing something different, and they need to maximize user productivity at the same time. And those are sometimes mutually exclusive given the status quo of security management today. Also, organizations need a way to very rapidly recover from the physical loss of a device, or if they get hit with ransomware, their files being wiped out. They need to have good backups. They need to have snapshots, really so that devices can be restored to a known good state, so that if you lose a physical device like a smartphone or a laptop, you can restore it very quickly, or restore a new one very quickly. If you have a ransomware infection, you need to be able to recover from that and re-image the machine very quickly so that the employees can get up and running again. And in many organizations today, they don't have those capabilities to be able to do that. So enter cloud security. Is the cloud more secure? Yeah, in a word, yes. Certainly on-premises can be a secure way to store data. In many cases, it's not. For example, consider the biggest data breaches you've heard about, whether it's Target or Equifax or, name your data breach, Heartland, for example. You're looking at primarily a breach of on-premises infrastructure. It was file shares or file storage somehow that's on premises that was breached. In most cases, in the vast majority of cases, in fact, it's not the cloud storage or the cloud file shares that were breached, but those that were on premises. And part of the reason for that is that the cloud effectively separates data from physical devices. If you lose a device, or if you get a ransomware infection on a device where all the data is stored in the cloud, not locally, you have a much greater level of protection for that data than if it was stored locally on the device. And so organizations are beginning to realize this. Decision makers see the cloud really as a way around their security problems. Certainly not a panacea. It's not going to solve every problem, but it is going to be a major step forward in advancing security. So in terms of recommendations, and again, these are going to vary based on the organization size and the industry you're in and so forth. But fundamentally, you should separate physical devices from data by using and storing data in the cloud, not at the endpoint. If you have a desktop computer, a laptop, a smartphone, a tablet, what have you, and it doesn't contain data on the device itself, but merely accesses it from the cloud, you're much more secure if that data is, or if that device is somehow infected with ransomware, or if the device is lost. You need to do continual backup processing through snapshotting so that you can recover from the physical loss of devices or data loss through ransomware. Taking regular snapshots so that if you do have an infection, you can restore things very quickly. And then finally, focus on the much bigger picture of security plus more secure user access. It's fundamental really to understand that if you go with the cloud, again, it's not going to be a panacea. It's not going to solve all of your security problems, but it is going to be a much more secure environment. You're going to have much more secure user access, much greater control for IT over corporate data and so forth. Okay, and at this point, I would like to hand things over to Ali. Ali, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Michael. So what you've heard so far from Michael and from the research at OSTERMAN is really coming down to a couple key security concerns. One is around ransomware, the other one is device loss, and of course some related security issues such as malware. And so the question is, how do you really navigate around this? And I was going to take just a few minutes, a quick 5 minutes or so, to go over this from a dinCloud perspective. And what I'll start with is this diagram that you'll see on the screen right now. And what it's showing you is how you can use a hosted workspace, and in our case, whether that's a desktop as a service, it's a remote session that you're using, or it's just a published application using the cloud. On the left side, you can see that there's a lot of different scenarios or use cases for how someone may want to access this virtual or hosted workspace and then get secure access into a hosted private cloud, and then that gives you access to applications and to the data. And so what you can see here is, number one, is that there's a separation between the device and the data as well as the applications that are users accessing. And that allows you, in the case of device loss, to really not worry about what happened with that device, whether it's a BYOD situation, it's a personal machine, or it's just something that got lost. You don't have to worry about corporate data being lost with the device, and that helps avoid all these embarrassing breach disclosures and things like that. The other piece comes in with the ransomware, and one of the things that came along with the recommendation side is doing backups, doing snapshots, and those are also services that you can get through the cloud, specifically through dinCloud, and that means that every day there's a backup being performed at the individual workspace or at the virtual desktop level. And so at an individual user level, if someone gets infected by ransomware, what they'd be able to do is go back in time, pick up a day-old virtual desktop, and then be able to spin up a new session against it. And we can make adjustments and customize this for customers. So if someone needs something more frequently than a day, that can be possible as well. So the way that you handle this is by using a virtual desktop or a hosted workspace that dinCloud provides. And so on the left, you can see a separation between the device and you have, going through this hosted private cloud, you have separate data, separate applications. So if something happens to the device, whether it's lost, it's a personal device that the employee decides to take with them when they separate from the company's intellectual property is not tied to the device anymore. It's stored with a hosted private cloud that the company operates and controls fully. So that really changes the dynamic of these embarrassing breach disclosures. And then from a ransomware perspective, you have, one of the recommendations was around backups and snapshots. And that's something that dinCloud provides as well at the individual virtual desktop level. So each individual user, if they get infected, we can go back in time and retrieve a pristine version of the virtual desktop that was not infected with ransomware, and then discard the old one and replace it and get the user back up and running and productive. And that can be adjusted by customer requirements. If it needs to be more frequently within a day, we can always make those adjustments as well. A quick blurb on dinCloud. We are a cloud service provider, and from the beginning we've been providing desktops as a service, and that falls under our hosted workspaces category. We also offer cloud infrastructure, which is server hosting and security and those types of things. There's 5 key differentiators at dinCloud, and I'll just briefly touch on these, but I'm going to drill down on the security piece. So transparent pricing, what this refers to is traditionally when you go to a public cloud, you're looking at charges by the second, by the minute, by the hour, and these are not typically the types of things that our customers, that when we encounter them, are really looking to do is spin up and spin down by the minute, by the second. What they're trying to do is run their business in the cloud, and so for them, flat rate pricing is a better and more economical approach, and that's one of the key tenets for us. We also came about in 2011, so everything we've designed has been optimized for the cloud, whether it's the design of the hardware, whether it's the type of software-defined networking and software-defined data centers that we've developed as well. And then the last 2 at the bottom on this slide are really talking about the ease of use, customer experience, as another area that we really try to make sure that we remove the complexity from a customer's environment and from their experience in the cloud, because when you have more complex systems, then it really opens up the space for accidents or exposure when you don't have all your bases covered. So let me dive a little bit more into the security piece here. And for us, that really means protecting customers from outside threats and also providing resiliency, backup capabilities to our customers. And we do this at a couple different levels, and I'll touch on these over here in the next slide. So the first thing is our data centers. From a physical standpoint, we've partnered with Equinix, which is a publicly traded largest data center provider in the world, and that gives us a lot of built-in capabilities, whether it's around compliance and tier 3+ data centers, or specifically around the physical layers of security, and that includes access into the data center itself, access to the servers. We also protect the front and the back of our server racks with different codes, and we always are monitoring those through cameras as well. And then from a cybersecurity perspective, we've really put in a lot of extra layers of security. So there's not just a, if you will, a naked cloud available to the customer, and responsibility falls on the customer in terms of figuring out what type of security protocols and what type of security posture to put in place. And this really comes around having a firewall that the customer controls. All the networks, the virtual machines are run behind this dedicated firewall for each customer. And as a cloud provider, or as any of the staff at dinCloud, we do not have access to anything on the network from a customer perspective. The firewalls have DHCP, they have NAT, port forwarding, IPsec, VPNs. You can see some of these things mentioned on this slide here, and it's really around the concept of having a private cloud network isolation for our customers. As I mentioned, malware protection is provided as part of the foundation for the customer. So these are just the quick overview of some of the security considerations we feel helps keep our customers secure. And with this, we want to thank again OSTERMAN for the research, the insights that they provided, and we'll turn it over into the Q&A, and we just pause here so you have the contact information for everyone. and we'll also go over a couple of questions. This is a pre-recording that you're listening to, so if you don't see your question covered here, we'll also provide information on how to send questions over, and we'd be more than happy to answer those. And joining us on the panel to answer the questions is also Mark Gerke. He's our senior consultant at dinCloud, and so we'll go ahead and start taking a look at the questions.
Thanks, Ali.
Okay, so I'm taking a look at this question here, and about a social media breach. Okay, so there was a breach of social media data that the U.S. government had experienced on one of the cloud providers. They have 3 letters. I'm just editing that part. And the question is cloud, I guess the question is asking the comparison between public cloud or on-prem solutions. And Michael, maybe you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, that was a well-publicized breach of social media data that the U.S. government was carrying, and there was a misconfiguration error, and that data was exposed to the public. So, cloud is, as I mentioned earlier, cloud is not a panacea because you can still make mistakes. There can be configuration errors and so forth. It's just that those are much fewer and farther between in the cloud world, because you've got really carrier-grade data centers that are managing this data. You've got staffs that are, managing things on a 24/7 basis. They tend to be very well trained. And yes, mistakes will happen, but you're not going to see them as frequently, or the consequences of them being as serious usually in the cloud world as they are on premises.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well. In terms of the complexity, so that's where earlier in the differentiators you saw the ease of use and customer experience. So that's exactly to the point of having something simple. Make sure that you don't have these misconfiguration errors because of some overly complex system out there. So appreciate that question. Let's take a look here. The question is, what type of management and control do I get with dinCloud? Mark, maybe you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Ali. So as far as management and control, with our DIN Manage admin and cloud orchestration and management portal, customers have full control of everything. You can set up all the networking, the firewall rules, the VPN, have remote control of their resources, desktops and servers, can change resources on the fly, scale up, scale down, get all your alerting and reporting and trouble tickets in one location. So, with us, we give customers, as much control as they want.
Great, thanks, Mark. Okay, next question is around, let's see, ransomware. Okay, so the question is asking, on ransomware, there's been a lot of news and hype in this year, and do you expect it to increase or change in the coming year? Michael, maybe you guys have done some research on that, and you may have a good answer on that.
Yeah, I think it will increase. And in part, if you look at what cyber criminals are doing, they're changing their focus. If you go back 5 or 6 years, you see a lot of credit card theft. You look at the Target data breach, for example. The problem with data breaches from a cyber criminal perspective is that they have been so successful, and they have stolen so much information like credit cards and passports and so forth, that the value of those in the black market on the dark web has really gone down significantly. So cyber criminals are now turning to more lucrative ways of making money, and certainly ransomware is one of those, along with business email compromise and so forth, where they can go directly to the victim instead of stealing something from a victim and then having to sell it to somebody else. So I think we're going to see a lot more ransomware next year. We'll see a lot more business email compromise. I don't think we'll see the explosive growth that we did, but certainly we're going to see major increases. It would not surprise me at all to see 100% growth in ransomware in 2018 compared to this year.
Wow. Okay, well, at least people are aware, and so they can start to take some action so they're not caught off guard completely. Okay, the next question is actually quite a lot of different questions around security. It's asking about, I'm just going to combine these ones. There's questions around encryption. How do you isolate, it says the word things, but how do you isolate, I guess, the customer environment? There's a question around multi-factor authentication and also around different types of compliance. So with that, Mark, I'll give you that, full question.
Sure, thanks, Ali. So dinCloud, how we differentiate ourselves, one of the areas, as Ali had mentioned, is performance, another being security. So we host out of, tier 3 plus, world-class facilities, number one, extremely secure, meet all, have all necessary certifications as far as SOC 1 and 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, PCI DSS compliant, NIST, FISMA compliant, etc. So the world-class facilities. And then when we give each customer their own dedicated isolated environment, we isolate things at the network layer. Everybody has their own dedicated virtual appliances, so there's no multi-tenancy. So it's basically like an extension of their on-premise environment. And whatever they can do on-premise, they can do in our environment. And then we include a number of security tools, like the multi-factor authentication, perimeter security, network-based security, host-based security, including encryption in transit and encryption at rest. We have managed services that we can wrap around as far as managed antivirus, malware, web filtering, content filtering, patching, vulnerability and compliance scanning, etc. So we're one of the few providers that can provide a totally isolated, secure environment.
Great. Okay, and I have a question here on identity access. Okay, so if a customer has an existing identity control access management software tool, can they also incorporate or integrate that into the cloud?
Yeah, I'll take this. This is Mark. I'll take that one. Great question. As I'd mentioned, each customer gets their own dedicated, isolated environment. So whatever they can do on premise, they can do with us. Typically, identity and access management solutions are going to integrate with, Active Directory for, user authentication, access control, and policy information. We host a dedicated Active Directory for each customer. So as far as integrating with third-party tools, whether they're single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, identity and access management, no issues whatsoever.
Great. And a question here on, can I visit a data center and do my own inspection?
Yeah, absolutely. We're very proud to, to provide data center tours. We host out of world-class facilities, as we've mentioned. So yeah, absolutely, we can schedule a tour at any time.
Okay, great. So again, I want to thank Michael Osterman, and I also want to thank Osterman Research for the insights they provided. Thank you, Mark Gerke, for help with the questions. And again, this is Ali Din with dinCloud. We appreciate you taking the time to be join this webinar. And again, we'll provide information if there's additional questions that didn't get addressed here. And also for attendees that are listening to this, you can also get access to our security posture white paper, which will provide information on how to access that as well. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
So with that, I'd like to thank our speakers, Michael Osterman and Ali Din, and thank all of you for joining and for your questions. You can stay tuned to dincloud.com/webinars for upcoming topics and past recordings. Thanks so much and have a great day.